listeners, and welcome to the NKNews Podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today it's the morning of Thursday, the 9th of December in Seoul, and I'm joined via Zoom by former AP Bureau Chief Jean Lee to talk to me about her experience of reporting on North Korea from inside North Korea. Before we get started, please leave a review about the podcast. That's all I want for Christmas are some good reviews. Secondly, check out NKNews.org and consider buying a subscription that funds the journalism that we put out every day. And thirdly, check out NKNews.org/shop for our NK leadership chart, which I have on the wall behind me, art posters, the 2022 calendar, and more. As always, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. All right, to introduce my guest today properly, Jean Lee is an American journalist who opened the first US news bureau in Pyongyang, that of Associated Press, or AP, just about 10 years ago. She's also co-host of the excellent BBC podcast Lazarus Heist. If you haven't heard that yet, please do yourself a favor and binge it after hearing this interview. Jean currently does analysis at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. You can find Jean on Twitter @NewsJean. Thanks for joining me on the show today, Jean.
Hi, great to join you.
And should we explain to listeners that you're not very well at the moment? You're suffering from long COVID, so we may need to take a break, but that shouldn't affect the quality of the interview.
That's fine. Yes, I did get very sick with COVID early on in the pandemic, and I'm still suffering the consequences, the lingering symptoms. So I apologize in advance. Sometimes it can make it very hard for me to express my thoughts, but hopefully we'll power through.
But you're looking and sounding well, at least. So, but I am sorry to hear that you've had these lingering symptoms for so long. I do hope you get over that soon.
Thank you.
Okay, you were working for AP here in Seoul, I think, when 10 years ago the agency signed a contract with North Korea, an agreement to open a bureau in Pyongyang. This was supposed to happen almost exactly 10 years ago in December 2011, but ended up being put off until early 2012 because of Kim Jong-il's death. Can you give us a little bit of the inside story on how and why AP came to be the first people to open a bureau in Pyongyang?
So I was posted to Seoul in September of 2008. And, my first day as AP Seoul Bureau Chief was on September 9th, 2008. And if you follow the North Korean calendar, you will know that this was North Korea's Hwangap, their 60th anniversary, the 60th anniversary of the founding of North Korea. And so a huge anniversary for the North Koreans. And so I'd been working in London for years as a correspondent and editor, and was, with this new posting, was keen to get to Seoul as quickly as I could in time for this anniversary, because what we were expecting was to see Kim Jong-il appearing at that parade. And that was the day when he did not appear. And so certainly we were consumed by the question of what was happening to Kim Jong-il, but also what happened just before we turned the feed on to see what was happening in North Korea. My boss told me that my mission would be to open an AP bureau in Pyongyang. So I had these two big things happen on my first day of work. And I would say that when I was told this, I was thinking, I don't even know how you get a visa to get into North Korea. How do you open an office there? But just a little background. The AP president at the time, Tom Curley, was somebody who was on a quest to open AP bureaus in places where the US had an adversarial relationship. Mm-hmm. And so before Pyongyang, there was Cuba. So there was an AP bureau that opened in Havana. And before that, Hanoi. And so there was a pattern, and it's a really interesting mission of trying to get into places and establish a presence and get reporters on the ground in countries where US news organizations had limited access. And Pyongyang was next on this list. So this was a mission that he really championed at the time. And I was just the person tapped to try to carry out that mission.
Okay, so it was a given from the word go that you were going to be the one to do it.
But I don't know if there were previous bureau chiefs who were given that task as well. But this became my mission. And people often ask me, why did you choose to go to North Korea? It wasn't a choice. Certainly any foreign correspondent based in Seoul who covers Korea thinks about, how do I get into North Korea? I mean, because how do you cover a country from the outside when you can't get in there? It's ideally, we want to get on the ground. And I can tell you, and I hope we'll get into this discussion, my understanding of North Korea is so different from having spent time on the ground. And it does break my heart that correspondents today haven't had that opportunity.
Yeah. Recently, I spoke to former CNN reporter Mike Chinoy, who had hoped many years ago that CNN would be the first to open a bureau in Pyongyang, but that never happened. But what's the value in your mind of opening a full-time bureau in North Korea?
Yeah, I used to look at Mike's dispatches they're still on YouTube if anyone wants to look at them, because he really was, in a sense, one of our predecessors. There was a trickle of American correspondents who were able to get into North Korea, but under very controlled circumstances, I would say. The AP also, when I went back into the AP archives, Edith Lederer, who is still the UN correspondent for AP based out of New York, also made kind of one of the early junkets to North Korea in the 1970s.
Wow.
And actually looking at the pictures from her trip, what struck me was that the trip was very similar to the kind of trips that foreign correspondents until a couple of years ago were making in Pyongyang as well. And so there's a difference, I think, in being based on the ground and being part of the local foreign press corps and being a reporter who's brought in on a government junket or on a government organized tour. And not to say that those trips aren't useful. I went into Pyongyang not on my first trip, but on my second trip on such a media event. And even those trips can be hugely insightful, but they can't compare to, those trips you're on a 3, 4, 5-day whirlwind organized trip with a couple government guides. Usually, in my case, sometimes they were, on that first trip, they were diplomats. And you're on a very strict schedule and shown the best parts of Pyongyang. You were there to help project the propaganda. When you're there running an operation, as the Chinese and the Russians do, for me, I was there for days, weeks on end. You can't put on a show for that period of time, for that long a period of time. And so you get to see what daily life is truly like away from all that theater. And you're also a part of the society in a way that you can't be as a visitor. And so that means in setting up the bureau, of course we had to shop locally. Of course we had to stock the office. And so I became a part of the economy. I understood how the economy worked as somebody who was building an operation on the ground. You have different rights as essentially as somebody who's living there and working there than you do as a visitor. And I've been there in many different circumstances. I've kind of tested out all the different ways that you visit North Korea, so I understand all the differences as well.
Yeah.
And there is a difference in your access when it comes to being based there versus visiting on one of these trips organized by the government.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of actually living and working on the ground there? What was the longest single stretch that you were in there for, and where did you live?
So, to be technically speaking, as a U.S. citizen, we don't have diplomatic relations with North Korea, and we were not allowed to have the same kind of residential visa that aid workers and diplomats from countries that have diplomatic relations are able to get. And same with the Russian and Chinese journalists had visas that allowed them to go in and out of the country. That said, I was given kind of a modified status in a sense. I was given many of the privileges of foreigners who live in North Korea without actually having that visa. And so the longest that I stayed, it was usually 3 to 5 weeks. I would stay 3 to 5 weeks at a time, but it was very difficult. I would say living and working in North Korea is very challenging. And so 3 to 5 weeks it's hard to imagine, but it's a grueling stretch of time in the circumstances that I was operating in.
Yeah.
And I should mention that I was still running the bureau in Seoul, the AP bureau. So at the time I was running both bureaus. And so I wanted to come back and check in with my bureau. So I came back every month to Seoul for a couple of days before turning back around. And, I wish that I could have driven my car straight through the border.
Yeah.
It would have saved me a lot of time because, as you know, it only takes us 45 minutes to drive from Seoul to the DMZ. And then from there, I mean, the distance is not that far, but the roads are so terrible.
The roads are
but
terrible.
it would only still, it would have taken door to door 3 hours. But for me, it took, it was a couple days.
Yeah.
Because of the DMZ, because of the border, I had to fly to Beijing, pick up my visa there, and then fly in the next day to Pyongyang. So it was a 2-day journey to get to my office in Pyongyang.
And where was the office located?
So the office is located next to along the Botonggang River, inside the KCNA building.
Okay.
And so it was right across the river from one of the new apartment complexes that Kim Jong-un is building.
And did you live nearby?
I lived for the most part at the Koryo Hotel, which is not far.
One.
Yep, absolutely. And that is a hotel that is very close to the Pyongyang train station. As anyone who travels to North Korea knows, it's got a great pub, and it tends to be a gathering place for expats as well as for North Korean elites. There were some times when I did choose to stay at other hotels, but I would say that I considered the Koryo Hotel my home.
Okay. And how would you commute to work each day? Did you have a bicycle or a car or a driver, or did you walk?
It's funny that you asked that, because I pushed to get a bicycle. It was something that I really wanted. And until for a long time, it was actually prohibited for women to ride bicycles in Pyongyang. And we were pushing very hard for me to get a bicycle once if and when those restrictions were lifted. But to be honest, it's extremely difficult to ride a bicycle in Pyongyang because of the rules. You can't just ride a bicycle across any street. You have to take it into the underpass. So in any case, I never quite succeeded in getting a bicycle. I brought a car. I brought a car to Pyongyang from China. And so we had our own vehicle.
Okay. Did you drive it in all the way across from from Dandong?
I wish I had. No, it was shipped to Pyongyang, and it was shipped to North Korea. I did not drive it myself. We had a driver who, the rules and regulations are so tricky. Even just, I don't know how many times we were yelled at because even my driver, who's experienced and North Korean, was breaking the rules. It's very tricky to drive a vehicle in North Korea. I know a lot of foreigners do it. Foreign diplomats do it, but I had a driver.
Now, before you went in on each trip, did you know roughly kind of what stories you wanted to cover?
So I had a running list of stories and interviews that I would request on a regular basis, if you can imagine what those stories might be. But yes, I mean, I think that one of the challenges in North Korea is access. And it's not a country where you can pop up, and you can't turn up at the airport and just get in touch with people and set up interviews and visit. It's not that kind of a place. So it's a real it's a real challenge because everything needs to be requested well in advance. And
Yeah.
not only would I spend a lot of time making those requests and trying to figure out, it's also, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get around the surveillance so that I could trust that my interviews were candid and accurate. So it's unlike any assignment or any country I've covered. And as a foreign correspondent, even though sorry about that. Somebody, I don't know if you can hear that, but somebody's at the door.
I heard a doorbell, yeah.
Yeah, we'll just ignore that. But even though most of my career has been built around this one very challenging assignment of North Korea, but I've worked in many, many dozens of countries as a foreign correspondent on assignment. And we pride ourselves on being able to parachute into a country and to cover it well. North Korea is a completely different challenge, not only when you're covering it on the ground, but when you're covering it from the outside. But covering it on the ground brings with it a whole other set of challenges and complications. In some ways, I would say it's easier to cover North Korea from the outside.
Yeah.
It's a much bigger challenge to try to get on the ground. And there are some news organizations that have decided we're not even going to try to get on the ground. While I respect that, I think that I give more credit to news organizations that do try to navigate the challenge of getting on the ground and what that means for the reporters and for their reporting.
Right. Would you look at like local media to see if there was a story that was interesting to you that you could follow up on?
By local media, do you mean local North Korean or South Korean media?
The local North Korean, like the newspapers or the TV or the billboard, like in the subway station that have the paper up and things like that.
So absolutely. I mean, I think that and this is something that we all should be doing as we watch North Korea, is paying very close attention to their state media. Even though it is propaganda, there is something very useful within that propaganda, and it can serve as a starting point, right? So for me, understanding where they were investing their resources was very helpful to understanding what their priorities were. And also, you knew as well that those were places where you were likely to get access. So once you have that access, what do you do with it? And that's the next step to reporting. And so absolutely, I would pay very close attention to, I read their state media thoroughly on a daily basis and watched their state TV. For me, it also went beyond that. I watched their dramas, I watched their documentaries.
Right.
All of their content needs to be taken with a grain of salt because it's propaganda, but there's so much that we can still learn from it, and it can serve as a starting point. You know, as a journalist covering North Korea, you need to look at all sources of information, not only state media, also speaking to sources outside the country. So you kind of need to triangulate information from all those different sources in different cities, capitals, including in Pyongyang. But I felt that it was useful. In some ways, it can be difficult to get information on the ground in North Korea because it is so compromised. But you just add that to all the information that you get from other places so that you start building a cohesive narrative. And then for me, a lot of what I learned did not make it into my reporting, to be honest. It can be a challenge to write for a wire service because the way that we do journalism in the West does require us to verify and find additional sources. For me, what I learned on the ground as a journalist in North Korea was everything that I absorbed by being there, by living there, by working there, by being with North Koreans 24/7. Some of that may not get into my news coverage, but it certainly informs how I understand what life in North Korea is like. And that was invaluable. That is the kind of thing that I try to share a bit in my podcast with some of the stories that I share from my time in North Korea. These are elements and stories that may not have made it into my reporting, but I think have certainly shaped my understanding of who Kim Jong-un is, what his priorities are, and what the people think and feel, because that is often the missing component in our coverage of North Korea.
Did you feel that there were any big stories that the North Korean government kept from you so that you know, to try to stop you from finding out about things?
Of course, absolutely. And there were, you know, I certainly wanted to visit a prison camp, for example, to see what the conditions like. That's something I was not able to do.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to visit the Pyongyang nuclear complex.
Oh, yeah.
That was something I wasn't able to do. That was something that they knew was very high on my list of sites that I wanted to visit.
Yeah.
So certainly there were things, an interview with Kim Jong-un was something that I wasn't able to carry out, which I had hoped I would be able to have before my tenure was up. So there's certainly a long list of things that I never quite got to, and that it was very difficult for them to arrange. And yet there were many, many, many other things that we were able to do that were a first. And I don't know how many times I turned up somewhere and I was not only, the first American that they had met, but also the first foreign journalist. And so for me, it was always about pushing those boundaries, getting to places that no journalist had been to, so that I could get beyond the capital, see what life was like, get to know the culture, get to know what the reality of life was like. And so even though there were stories that I wasn't able to cover, and I would say that as a journalist, that was certainly true my entire career. I was just thinking about in my early years as a journalist in California, one of the stories that I was trying to do was about gang baiting in the California prison system. So an investigative piece about how guards were pitting gang members from rival gangs in fights on the prison grounds. And, I think getting permission to get into the prison took months of persistent requests. And I did finally get into the prison where Charles Manson was being held. But likewise, I would say that every government has the hurdles to access. North Korea just has the most extreme hurdles to access.
In May 2014, so that's, what are we, 7.5 years ago, an unfinished apartment building collapsed in Pyongyang, and then a rare public apology was issued by a representative of the North Korean government. Were you there when that happened?
I was not. I was on sabbatical. So, I was on sabbatical that year. So I wasn't in Pyongyang. I believe I think I had been in Pyongyang earlier that year, but not when the building collapse happened itself.
Okay.
And I do remember it very clearly. I mean, absolutely devastating. Certainly a revelation to how perhaps shoddy their construction techniques were. But as you are probably suggesting, also really interesting because with something like that, that's an occasion where we don't get to see the kind of reporting that we would see anywhere else. It's an example of how they're able to really control and cover up these disasters, not only from their own people, but from the international media and from the rest of the world. I mean, there's no greater example of this than the death of the leaders. So we had, as you mentioned, your first question was, I was supposed to go open. Yeah, I mean, just going back to that question to give you an example, I was in Beijing 10 years ago. So around this time, I think I was working on breaking a story. I was working on breaking or confirming the news that there was a landmark U.S. North Korean deal in the works. And so I actually got that confirmation, broke the story about what we call the Leap Day deal. They eventually signed it on Leap Day of 2012. But in December 2011, I was frantically trying to confirm the rumors that this deal was in the works. I think I reported that story, and then I headed to the airport on the 19th of December, go open the AP Bureau on December 20th. And that was when, on the 19th, we heard that Kim Jong-il had died.
Right.
He had, in fact, died on the 17th. So this is the 10-year anniversary is coming up. So we're going to see a lot of activity around that in the coming weeks in North Korea.
Yeah.
But he had died on the 17th, but the North Koreans kept it under wraps for 2 days before announcing it.
And even with smaller stories, there is a time lag, right? That North Korea can be quite slow. Like, if Kim Jong-il goes to China and meets Xi Jinping, you may not read about that in North Korean media until a good couple of days have elapsed.
Yes, so they have such a tight control over the flow of information. And that's one of the concerns that I have right now, given the border closures, the lack of a presence of, Western, not even journalists, obviously, but diplomats and aid workers as well. It's just that tight control over the flow of information. They're very good at it. And so it makes it very hard for us to know what's actually happening. It's inconceivable in this day and age that the leader of a country would die and they would be able to control that information so closely. And of course, when Kim Jong-il years earlier when I was referring to 2008, when Kim Jong-il, the late leader, suffered a stroke and fell into a coma, we didn't see him from August to the following April.
Right.
And just an unbelievable control over the flow of information. And that's how North Korea manages to shape the narrative. And I've never seen it as strictly enforced as now. And that's partly why I wanted to get on the ground. It's like, what are we missing? But like you point out with the apartment collapse, my former colleagues at the AP did not report on it either. So their local staff failed them in that sense as well. If they knew about it and kept it from them. And I don't know how much they knew about it.
Yeah.
But, I think that things happen in parts of the world or in places that we in the news media don't always learn about until a little bit later. But certainly any kind of breaking news in North Korea is a huge challenge.
Do you feel that AP had to pull its punches at all while reporting in Pyongyang? Because while being a journalist there on the ground, in another sense, you could also end up becoming a hostage if things go very wrong. And I was reminded of the case of BBC TV journalist Rupert Wingfield Hayes when he was reporting inside North Korea, and he said something that they didn't like, and they took him aside, and he was, I think, detained for 12 to 24 hours or something. So did that hold you back a little bit?
So I would say that I know from the outside, it looks like, and I would say that his situation was a little bit different from mine. I mean, every journalist's situation is a little bit different, so we can't really generalize. In his case, if I were him, he was traveling with a delegation. He was brought in by a delegation of foreigners who were on an official trip to North Korea. Those are slightly different circumstances. And if I were him, I would also you'd have to be mindful not only of jeopardizing the delegation that you're with and their objectives, but if you go in under uncertain circumstances, like if it's not clear that you're going there to report.
Oh, I think I have to interrupt. I think you might be confusing the other BBC guy, Sweeney, I forget his first name there, who went in, as you say, with the London School of Economics and then ended up making a documentary about it, kind of under false pretenses. But I was thinking
there's that case too, but I am thinking about Rupert Wingfield Hayes. He went in with a group of Nobel laureates. And, but so in that case, you have to think, so what I'm trying to get to is that each situation is difficult. And as a reporter who's there, if you're not experienced with North Korea, then many foreign correspondents go in there with the objective, it's their one and only chance to get into North Korea. And it's their one and only chance possibly to have that dateline, to see what's happening and to report. But with each circumstance, you have to think about, for example, he would have perhaps put not only his delegation in jeopardy or in trouble, but also his hosts, his guides. And so this is not to criticize, it's just that every situation is different. Now, and that's the same, I think, for me, in the sense that people may look at it from the outside, and I was often accused of, as you say, pulling my punches. But you have to understand that there are a lot of stakeholders, and it's not just me that I'm worried about. Obviously, as an American correspondent, we are under extreme scrutiny because we are often characterized, or I should say mischaracterized, or assumed to be working for the US government. Because many North Korean journalists do, they do work for their government.
Mm.
And no matter how many times I said I don't work for the US government, it was
Yeah.
hard for them to understand that. So you need to go in there understanding that you're under a different kind of scrutiny. That said, that was not my concern. That was a concern. But my biggest concern certainly was, when you run an operation in North Korea, it's not just you. You've got North Koreans working for you. So for me, it's not just about my own safety. It's about the safety of the people who are working for me. And I think that's a point that gets missed, by critics of coverage of North Korea. But there's some reporting that you can do in North Korea, but there's some reporting that you can do more effectively and just as effectively outside the country without jeopardizing the safety of the people who are working for you. So, you've got to protect your sources, you've got to protect your colleagues. And so when I say that you triangulate information, what I mean when you put together a story about North Korea is that you don't just rely on what you rely on sources that you get all over the world for different reasons. And so if you were to look at my coverage at the time, I certainly made an effort to make sure that certain information came from certain sources in certain places. So this is a level of nuance about the coverage of North Korea that many critics don't get. And that's fine. People have a political reason for why they want to attack coverage of North Korea, but it's a very complicated, when done right and when done ethically, is very complicated, and it should be. And so it's not an easy question. It's not just about did you pull your punches? I wouldn't put it that way. I would say that I was very concerned not only about my own safety, but the safety of the people who work for me. And it's a complicated issue, but anybody who works in North Korea understands what I'm talking about.
It's a very complicated issue, as you say. Did government people ever North Korean government people try to exert any editorial input or control on what you were writing?
They certainly tried to suggest where to go and what to see. And that's why I make the distinction between working on the ground versus coming in on the kind of trips that most foreign correspondents come in on. Because often those correspondents don't have much say about where they're going to be taken. But for me, I think that my staff on the ground knew after a period of time that they could suggest places for me to visit, but that I wouldn't go unless it was a place that I chose or asked to visit. So this was a huge victory for me in the sense of I really needed, as a journalist, as a Western journalist, to be able to pick and choose where I went. It's not easy. And that's the benefit of having an operation on the ground and a benefit of being a journalist who understands how things operate. So so in that sense, of course, they tried, but they also were respectful, and they came to anticipate that I would say no.
Right.
Now, the biggest accomplishment for me or achievement was for us to agree that what I do as an American journalist is very different than what North Korean journalists do, and to agree to disagree on how we approach journalism. I'm sure that what they wanted was for all, and what they want is for all foreign media to serve as a mouthpiece and to project their propaganda.
Yeah.
And I would say that, unfortunately, when we go into these organized trips for these big events, we do serve that role. When we cover the big military parades, we project the image that North Korea wants the world to see. We are, in a sense, projecting their propaganda. And so it's important to try to get past that. That is a chance to get into the country, but journalists have to find a way to get past what it is the government in North Korea wants us to project, and to find ways to shed some light on what's happening beyond that propaganda. I haven't really seen, I think that Will Ripley and Mike Chinoy and any other journalist who's been there multiple times will tell you that the more you go, the more you understand.
Yeah.
And it takes many, many trips to really get a sense for what's happening, because the theater is so well done, and the regulations and the kind of restrictive nature of our travel there when you're there with a government retinue is so strictly organized. But the more a journalist goes, the more time they spend on the ground, the more they understand what's real and what's not. And I shouldn't say what's real, but there is an element of theatricality to North Korean society. They want us to see the prettiest parts of their society. So getting beyond that and trying to show not just the pretty parts, but also the full picture takes time. And the problem is that journalists today don't have that opportunity.
In December 2014 on NK News, Nate Sayer wrote an article in which he alleged, based on having seen a confidential document and interviews with then current and former AP staff, that top executives of AP had agreed to distribute North Korean propaganda through the AP or under the AP name, and that AP's news gathering was effectively under some level of control by the Ministry of State Security. Since you no longer work there, are you able to comment on that now?
Well, I would say, first of all, that Nate Thayer, is that his name?
Yeah, Nate Thayer.
Never interviewed me. And there's nobody in that operation who knows the operation better than me. And he'd never interviewed me. I don't know who he spoke to. I think it's possible that he looked at an early draft of KCNA's side of what they wanted, but that by no means an early draft. I mean, of course, the North Koreans can put forward what they want, but did I agree to that? Absolutely not. And so I think that's an example of irresponsible reporting, to be absolutely honest. And, it's disappointing. I mean, I think that you should make it clear that you didn't speak to the person who both negotiated and ran that operation. I don't know who he spoke to for that reporting. And I don't know if he spoke to, I don't remember if anybody was quoted from the AP to confirm the details of that draft agreement. But all I'll say is that, yeah, the North Koreans were perfectly entitled to propose what they would like. But I by no means would agree to that. So I think that that's an example of, I would question the reporting. It was a disappointing article, certainly, I think, detrimental to the effort of foreign journalists to get on the ground by mischaracterizing the agreement. Now, I should say that there are many news organizations that do have agreements. So the AP does have agreements with news organizations, or I should say, KCNA. Many news organizations do have an agreement where they receive North Korea state media. And Yonhap, which is the South Korean news agency, and AP and AFP and other news organizations have an agreement to also distribute images from KCNA and perhaps from state TV.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely ludicrous to think that any Western news organization would agree to distribute propaganda. Maybe it's a technical term, because frankly, even when you are distributing North Korea state photos, that is technically propaganda. But then you could accuse Yonhap News and every other news organization, Reuters, every other news organization of promoting North Korea's propaganda.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it makes it very challenging. What we do in the US is, as an American reporter, it's somewhat easier. I think it was easier for the Chinese and Russian journalists on the ground, because they perhaps played a different role and had a different objective. But for us, we have very different standards. And to carry out the kind of journalism that we strive for in a place like North Korea is hugely challenging. And it is difficult when what you get is mostly propaganda. And that's why you need to do all that other legwork to try to get past that. I mean, I would have, it's the way that North Korea does its reporting is they report on, what they do is propaganda, and they're very proud. They're very proud to play that role, completely different from what we do.
Did you meet Russian and Chinese, and I think there's a Cuban journalist based there. Did you meet those locally based foreign reporters who, as you say, are doing kind of different work to what you did? And did you have a collegial relationship with them?
Absolutely. I did see some South Korean. Yeah, I think there's some sort of a mystique around who those journalists are, but for those of us who were on the ground, we were all friends. And one of my objectives was to try to make sure that we were all tight and that we were all communicating. So, the North Koreans did their best to try to divide us. And there's so much about working in North Korea that helps you understand how they think and how they manage foreigners.
Yeah.
And it's certainly working there certainly shaped my understanding of how they approach negotiations, for example, how
Right.
they approach business deals, because I had my own business deal to manage. One of the things they tried to do was really divide all of us journalists. And so I made an effort to bring all of us together. And I think that was very frustrating for them because but then we all learned how to, I would say, use our different types of access as a group to try to push for better access. And oddly enough, I think I was the ringleader. I was the one who had the most leverage. You would think it would be the Chinese and the Russians, but actually, as the American, I had the most leverage.
Wow.
So absolutely, it was very, very close to, except for the Japanese journalists who would come in from Kyoto from time to time. They listened to the North Koreans and did not sort of fraternize with us. But the Russian and Chinese journalists were among my closest friends in Pyongyang.
Now, your local North Korean staff who worked with you for AP, where did they come from? Did they have a journalistic background, and what was the process of recruiting them like?
Yeah, they were journalists, and one of them did speak fluent English, the other did not. He came from a broadcast background, and so I would say they were, how can I put it? I mean, I would say their first loyalty was to North Korea. But they were very hardworking and did their best to get everything that I wanted. And it was actually both frustrating and incredibly rewarding to work with them, because I was able to not only learn so much about North Korean life from them, but also teach them some of the tricks and tricks of our trade as well.
Yeah.
Teaching them how to network, teaching them how to build sources. I did actually conduct an interview process, interviewed a number of journalists, and selected them from the journalists that we interviewed.
I think it was, my memory's fading a bit now, but I was talking to somebody recently who mentioned interviewing North Koreans for a position, and there were two candidates, and one of them could speak no English, and the other one could. So it was very clear who the government wanted him to pick for that particular position. But in your case, the people you interviewed, they were all capable, and you just chose who you thought was the best one?
So, to be honest, I didn't get my first choice, but she was a valuable asset to KCNA's English service. So, unfortunately, I didn't get my top choice. But the young man who, as I mentioned, speaks fluent English was my second choice. And he was somebody who had been raised overseas and was young and energetic and was eager to learn. And it was actually an absolute delight working with him. So I'm glad that I got my number two. So we had, I think that, it's a difficult, it's a challenging, it's not like any other country where you can post a job notice. And that's just as reflective of how things work in North Korea as well.
Right.
North Koreans do not have the freedom to pick and choose, the path that they want.
Yeah.
They have a certain amount of freedom, but it's pretty constrictive. It's pretty constrained compared to what we're used to in the West. And so that's part of the understanding of their society as well, and how rigid it is, and how, they are routed into their education, into university, according to what they can offer the state, frankly. And so we tend to look at and criticize North Korean society because we're looking at it from the filter of our Western upbringings. And that's not to say that it doesn't deserve criticism, but it's just to say that when you're there, you also have to look at it. Understanding how people end up where they are requires understanding their system. It doesn't mean sanctioning it, or, I still think it breaks my heart that people don't have freedom in North Korea in any sense of the word.
Yeah.
But again, we need to understand how their system works. And there's I think a very complex set of qualities that contribute to who would even qualify to work for an American news organization. Now, remember that every single person who worked for me would have been under incredible scrutiny. They're going out on a limb, because anytime you work with a foreigner, there's the risk of influence. And we're seeing that now. I think we see right now we see the danger of foreign influence, right? And we see reports in some media about how North Koreans are punished because they're listening to BTS or listening to South Korean pop music or watching South Korean dramas. And likewise, we have to remember that the North Koreans who work with us are also putting themselves in jeopardy. So the North Koreans are also looking and thinking very carefully about who the right people are, so to put into that position. So I think it's a really complicated formula.
And did you hang out together with these people after work and visit each other's houses and go for meals and whatnot?
I mean, I was pretty much with them, I would say, 24/7.
Yeah.
They essentially lived with me while I was there. Obviously, they had their own lodgings, but when we traveled, we stayed in home. We traveled outside the capital on every reporting trip I made, and we stayed in hotels in the countryside, and so we were playing games, and they taught me North Korean card games and drinking games and all of that. And so absolutely, I spent a lot of time with them, and that was invaluable time. It was certainly a chance to get to know them and get to know what their lives were like and what life was like outside, away from all of that formality.
Yeah. Do you feel as a Korean American journalist that you received treatment different to that, either better or worse, that received by a non-ethnically Korean journalist?
Yeah, Jacko, I think that's a really good question. And since we're on a podcast, I should point out that I am a second generation Korean American. And I do think that that's different. I was born and raised in the United States, not in South Korea. And so in some ways, they could tell right away that I wasn't South Korean. And they understand in North Korea, they call it a dongbo, an overseas Korean. They understand that community in a sense. They have experience with that community. For example, they rely very much on their dongbo community in Japan, the Jocheonyeon. And they rely on their overseas community of Koreans in China, who live in those border provinces very close to North Korea. And so they understand when you've got these ethnic Koreans who go to North Korea who may not speak Korean fluently, who understand Korea a little bit differently, but come from the same ethnic background. And that to me was fascinating. And I think that they saw me as one of these dongpo from the United States. A little bit different because it's not, but just like the community in Japan, their country does not have, it's a country where their country has a very difficult relationship and a very difficult history. And I think that was what made my tenure as AP's bureau chief very different than any other bureau chief. And I think was part of why I was able to open an office. When they look at me, they didn't see that stereotype. So when you go to North Korea, as you know, the propaganda portrays Americans in a very specific way, right? I mean, how would you describe how they're portrayed?
Well, very racialized. So big nose, blonde-haired white men with evil intent, trying to do what they can to destroy the Korean race.
Yeah, we see that picture. I mean, the crooked nose thing. I mean, it's just like this evil ogre, right? So.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, I do think that they still have that propaganda is so deeply entrenched that, as you know, they start learning that propaganda from a very early age.
Yeah.
And so they still have a fear of when I would bring some of my American or foreign colleagues, they would just kind of recoil from them and out of a kind of, because it grows out of this discrimination
Yeah.
based on these stereotypes. But, when they look at me, that they don't see that. And so I
Right.
think that there was immediately one of those hurdles was erased. And, I still feel that it's important to try to be open-minded and objective. And I tried to go to North Korea with that kind of an approach and making sure that our coverage was balanced, making sure that I wasn't going in there with any kind of political objective. But of course, my coverage and my coverage today needs to be absolutely accurate as it can be, showing both the negative and expressing what their point of view is. So with our podcast, for example, with the Lazarus Heist,
Yeah.
it's very adamant that we try to reach out to the North Koreans and get their response.
Right.
Many news outlets don't even try. I mean, they'll say, well, we can't get a response. Why even try? But even for the Lazarus Heist, my goal was, hey, we're talking about North Korea. We need to get the North Korean response. And we did. And I certainly know how to write a letter to the North Koreans and how to get a response. But to also show how they portray and how they're going to react and what their response might be.
Back in the mid-2000s, there was a time when Pyongyang specifically didn't want any foreign aid or NGO workers coming into North Korea who could speak Korean. I don't know whether they saw that as a threat or suspected them of some spying or what it was, but there was an actual sanction against that. Now, how was it with you? You speak Korean. Did the North Korean government have any difficulty with that, or were they totally okay with it? Because you're a dongpo, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that my Korean is not totally fluent, first of all. And so one of the biggest forms of entertainment for my staff was to teach me how to speak like a North Korean.
Yeah.
So they actually love that. And so certainly we spent a lot of time trying to turn me into a North Korean, which was beneficial for me because I was able to then blend in. Was it a threat? No, I think that if I were totally fluent in Korean, like a South Korean, it might have felt like a threat. But no, I mean, I think that with my Korean, I was able to express that I understood the history, the shared history between the two Koreas. I knew their food. I knew in some ways some of the shared traditions, and that was somewhat of I think a reassurance for them. But I was still very American to them. To them, I was obviously very American. I think it's that question that comes up. I do think that foreign organizations should push for the right to bring in people who understand their culture and speak the language and can serve as a bridge. And that's how it should be conveyed. And they should fight against the desire to control the translation. For example, they sometimes will prefer to have people who are not Korean speakers because that way they can control what's translated.
Yeah.
With me, obviously, they knew that I understood everything that was happening. It gave me another layer of understanding. And I can tell you that not everything is translated into English for foreign correspondents.
Right.
And so you absolutely want to have somebody who speaks Korean there to catch all of that nuance.
Yeah.
To catch not just the propaganda, but all the jokes, all the sly comments, all of the good stuff is spoken in Korean and is not translated into English. And so this is something that news organizations should absolutely make a priority. And foreign NGOs and diplomats should also push for as I don't think it's up for negotiation. And frankly, foreign entities should have the right to bring in whoever they choose as whoever they think is best for that operation.
Right. Now, you mentioned that long 3 to 5 week trips could be quite grueling. Did you always? I know for some people when they go to North Korea, certainly for me, I've never been there more than a week, and I always feel like I'm on guard. I don't want to drink too many beers. I might say something or make the wrong joke. Did you always feel on your guard in North Korea? Were there moments of lightness and just complete relaxation as well?
I don't know that I was ever completely relaxed. I mean, I think North Korea is, and that's something that, for you as well, visiting, you had that sense of how difficult it is to live in a surveillance state. And I think it's really important to go there and experience that, to understand how difficult life is and how constrained life is, as the lack of freedom of movement, the lack of freedom of speech. There's no way for us in the West to understand that until we experience it. And we don't really have any equivalent in the rest of the world or in our worlds.
Yeah.
I never was able to relax. And I think that you operate there in a constant state of tension. And the people who think that they're relaxed, I think, don't quite know and don't really understand the level of surveillance, is my feeling.
Right.
And I often had this debate: is it better to be there totally oblivious and thinking that everything's fine, or is it better to be very highly attuned to it? I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that it was better to be? Would you rather have been oblivious, or do you think it was better to kind of have a sense of the surveillance?
Well, they do say ignorance is bliss, don't they? I mean, there's certainly some joy in being completely oblivious to the to what's around you. But in terms of trying to understand or being a truth seeker or a reporter, that's, you can't be oblivious. You have to have your eyes open and to see what are the stresses and the constraints around you.
I think that it's very difficult, for any tourist going in. They absolutely need to be briefed on the dangers of being in North Korea. And of course, we've seen some tourists. Otto Warmbier is the most tragic example.
Yeah.
Not fully understanding that you're operating in a country where the rules and regulations are very strict and that the consequences and punishment are very severe.
Yeah.
Something that might seem like a prank anywhere else is taken very seriously in a place like North Korea. And so we should never go to North Korea without understanding that.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for us because we've grown up with such liberty and such freedom, and it's very hard for us to understand and wrap our minds around. But the more you're there, the more you understand it. The more you're there, the more you feel it and you see it, and you are suffocated by it. And I think it gives us insight into what it's like to live as a North Korean as well. It's a little bit different because they grow up in it.
Yeah.
They learn to live with it. And likewise, I would say I learned to live with it in some ways. You learn when and where you can speak freely. But I would just say that because we haven't grown up with it, it's very hard on us. It's harder on us in some ways because we're not accustomed to it. I think, with the North Koreans as well, I think they grow up with that. They learn how to let loose when they can. They learn how to create safe spaces for themselves. They learn who to trust and how to protect themselves. And learning how they do that, their survival instinct, is fascinating.
For your colleague who grew up overseas, I wonder how it is for people like him that, they grow up, they're North Korean, they're with North Koreans, but still it's overseas. They can't have the complete level of acculturation or getting used to that sense of surveillance all the time. But once they go back to North Korea, bam, they're in it, they're dropped in it. And I wonder if it's harder for people like that, they've seen the outside, they've walked on land, as it were, and now they're back in the water. Did you ever sense that it was hard for him?
Well, so with my colleagues, I took my colleagues overseas multiple times. And so certainly you get to experience what life is like for them when they leave the country. But, I think that I did often wonder for North Koreans who spent the greater part of their childhoods with that relative freedom, how restrictive how hard it was for them to go back.
Yeah.
And for that very reason, Kim Jong-un is under a lot of pressure to try to keep them happy. Because there were, for many years until this border closure, North Koreans living, studying, working abroad.
Right.
And really learning, having relative freedom compared to their lives in North Korea. That said, I think that their lives are still fairly, they do check in. It's not complete freedom. They still have they're still tethered to Pyongyang, I think, in many ways. But I think that's why it is so important for Kim Jong-un to maintain their loyalty, to try to recreate and replicate their lives with some of the, if not the freedom, then with some of the goods that they got to enjoy when they were overseas. And not having that ability right now is certainly probably very difficult for his hold on leadership. But yeah, absolutely. It's that cognitive dissonance, that we think about, that how are they able to go between these two worlds? But we have to remember that the North Koreans who are sent overseas often are members of the elites who have standing in Pyongyang and are very invested in their futures in Pyongyang. And so they are able to understand that they do things differently outside the country, but they operate under their country's rules no matter where they are. And they know that their future is in North Korea, unless they choose to defect, which I think we're seeing more and more elites do. So it's really hard for us to understand. It's very mind-boggling. But when you work with North Koreans, you also understand that they employ a kind of cognitive dissonance to try to help them compartmentalize their experiences abroad and their experiences in North Korea.
Jean, when did your term as bureau chief in Pyongyang end? When was your last trip up there?
So I went on sabbatical in 2014, and I did make a trip with a tour agency in 2014. I'm trying to remember if it was 2014 or 2015. In 2014, and then I was on sabbatical again with the Wilson Center in 2015. I went back in 2017 with the Korean American Medical Association. And that was my last trip to North Korea, was in 2017. And for that, it was, wasn't as a tourist, but with this medical delegation of Korean American doctors who go there to carry out surgeries. So another very interesting experience as a dongpo, as an overseas Korean, really getting to know what their medical system was like and their healthcare system was like, something that I had done a lot of reporting on as a journalist as well.
If the Jean Lee of today could go back in time and meet the Jean Lee of 2011 right before going in to open the bureau, what would you like to have been able to tell yourself?
Oh my gosh, that I've never thought about that, but that is a really good question. I think, it's really what I have told myself. I think I would have advised myself. I would have tried to pace myself a bit better. It was such an intense period, if you remember, 2011, 2012, the early years of Kim Jong-un's leadership. There was so much we didn't know back in that time period. I just wasn't getting any sleep. We were working around the clock, and I was barraged by so much criticism about even just the pure fact that I was there in North Korea for whatever reason. And in some ways, I see it as it's always hard to be the first one. Also being a woman and being an Asian woman, I felt I was often unfairly characterized, unfairly targeted. And it made it very hard for me to do my job and to defend what we were doing. I think that if what I tell myself back then was to stay the course and to understand that to ignore the criticism, both coming from all the criticism and the pressure and the tension was coming from all directions at the time, and it made it very hard. I found it very paralyzing at the time, and I think I would have, if I could give myself counsel back, knowing what I know now, would be to pace myself and to look at the larger picture and the importance of everything. But to be honest, I think I did that. What I gained from that experience is the time that I spent getting to know the country on the ground. And that was something that was invaluable and that I carry with me and try to share today. It certainly informs my understanding of everything that's happening even today, even though it's been a while since I've been there. When you spend that much time on the ground, I think you know a place. And so I think I did accomplish in some ways what I wanted, which was a better understanding of North Korea. But I do wish that I had the ability to stay on the ground for a longer period. But to be honest, it was so grueling, so draining. It wasn't an assignment that anyone, I think, that many people could do for very long. And so I think that my advice would have been to just pace myself, ignore the criticism, and carry on. And that was the toughest thing to deal with at the time. And in addition to the challenges on the ground.
Yeah.
And but I think that for me personally, there was a great utility and usefulness in having the experience to get to know North Korea the way that I did. And I'm just heartbroken that we don't have, just for the sake of our understanding of North Korea, that we don't have more people on the ground who are able to get past that propaganda and get to know North Korea the way that I did.
What's the status of the AP Bureau in Pyongyang now? Is it effectively on hold? Or are local staff still reporting there?
I believe they have local staff reporting, but I would imagine that it's been quite some time since the AP has had anyone inside the country, which is a real shame. And certainly holding on to the Bureau and holding on to control of the operation is extremely difficult and should not be underestimated. And that's true that's true for any operation. As anyone who's working on the ground in North Korea, whether it's for an NGO or for an embassy, will tell you that just being able to hold on to that operation and survive inside that operation is a huge challenge and is a full-time job unto itself. So we'll see. I wish the best for that operation, and hope that there are more journalists who can get on the ground in the same way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that Treasury sanctions make it impossible. And so it may be that I just happened to be there at a time when North Korea was willing and open to letting an American journalist in the country, that door may have shut, and it may be some time before you see somebody like me there again.
Gosh. Are you writing, or do you plan to write a book on your experiences inside North Korea?
Well, I'm sharing quite a bit. I think that I share some of that experience through the podcast, and I hope that we'll be able to continue doing that. I have to say that, and I do hope to do more writing, and through my commentary and through feature stories and essays, which I find to be an easier format for including some of my North Korea experiences. Daily journalism is a very difficult format for that. That I can kind of share and impart those experiences, just so people have a broader understanding of what life is like on the ground. For me, one of the challenges is trying to reach one of my objectives is to reach a broader audience and to get more of the general public interested and engaged. And with the Lazarus heist, because it has done so well in the podcast world, I hope that people are not put off by the fact that it's about North Korea and cyber, but take a listen to it and are drawn into this country that is not only very interesting, but poses such a challenge for us geopolitically and in terms of security, and a country where the people we shouldn't forget about the people of North Korea and what they're going through, what they face. So I feel very lucky to have a platform now to get people interested in North Korea, and hopefully it'll draw them to your podcast as well, so that they ignite that sense of curiosity about this country that seems so far away, and to really humanize North Koreans so that they're not just this caricature like we saw in the interview, but a real country whose leadership, with leaders whose actions have real consequence, where diplomacy matters, and where challenges like their investment in cyber, that reaches us, and that an everyday person understands the motivations behind that cyber activity and understands why they should care about what's happening in North Korea.
When did the last episode of the Lazarus heist come out?
So it was a 10-part series that we unveiled this spring, and we will have hopefully more episodes to come.
Hey, that's what I was going to ask. That was my next question. Yeah, okay. So you've got an update.
So with the 10th episode, we did tease fewer episodes, and hopefully we'll be able to announce soon when those are coming out. But
great.
It's certainly an opportunity for me. Of course, my interest is I'm not a cyber expert, but my interest is just in providing the background or the context for that cyber activity,
Yeah.
And it's a chance to really tell some of these stories about North Korea, not only my own stories, but bringing defectors to tell their stories, to try to flesh out that picture of who these hackers are and why North Korea is investing in cyber. So it's been, I don't know how you're enjoying the podcasting world, but it's great to sometimes hear these stories and have these in-depth conversations.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's precisely why I've been doing it almost 4 years now. I'm really glad to hear that new episodes of the Lazarus Heist podcast are coming out soon. I'll be listening very much. I'll probably have to go back to episode 1 and hear it again and then hear the new ones. And I want to thank you once again, Jean, for coming on the podcast. You've been really great. And it was wonderful that we managed to get through without having a break. So that's great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, I appreciate it. And thanks for encouraging people to listen to the Lazarus Heist. I not only want to encourage feedback, I want people, your listeners in particular, who include a lot of North Korea observers, to reach out with ideas on where we should go next.
Right, because it's a mystery that's not complete. You know, there's still things to uncover, right? So people can send in their clues to you. Can also reach you on Twitter at NewsGene.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today's podcast. If you already have an NK News subscription, take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access at membership@nknews.org today. And if you have any feedback, questions, or future guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, to Arius Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating this episode, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks, and listen again next time.